Cimoooooooo! What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a card discussion on Evening Crescent and Autumn Shower. Now this is pretty remarkable because this is the last in the series of the Ghost Girl Hand Trap archetype, and it's pretty monumental considering the impact that these cards have had ever since they've been released, and now we're going to be wrapping it up with this one that is very reminiscent of a card that a lot of us may know in Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence, but you know, some of these have been absolutely game warping in the form of stuff like Ash Blossom, and some of them have had a lot to be desired when you look at stuff like Spooky Dogwood, so that's why I wanted to go ahead and bring you guys this video today. Now, before we get into it, I want to let you guys know that I am still selling my max rarity hoodies that are going to have gold foiling printed on them. You can check out the link down below over on Teespring. They're only going to be available till the end of January, so if you want to get yours, definitely buy yours now. Like I said, links are in the description, and thank you guys so much for supporting the new merch. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So, Evening Crescent and Autumn Shower is a level 3 wind zombie tuner effect monster with 0 attack and 1800 defense. Those stats may seem familiar, and it has an effect that reads: if your opponent special summons a monster or monsters face up, except during the damage step, you can discard this card. Then target one of those face-up monsters. Negate its effects until the end of this turn. Also, if that face-up monster leaves the field this turn, the player who controlled it takes damage equal to its original attack. You can only use this effect of Evening Crescent and Autumn Shower once per turn. So, when you take a look at this card on the surface, it's very reminiscent of Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence, because pretty much flat out, you discard it and you're negating the effect of something. But there's a lot more to it, and it's a little bit more complicated than that, because when you look at it, you're not using it in like direct response to an effect being activated. You have to use it when a monster is being summoned, and a lot of you might think that that's not a huge deal, but you have to think that actually matters a lot in some instances, especially when it comes to hard once per turn effects, because if you summon the monster and then it gets hit by the Evening Crescent, but you never actually got to use that effect, if you're able to summon another copy of the monster that you just summoned, then you're still technically able to use the effect because you're no longer under the effect of that Evening Crescent. So that can actually be kind of a bad thing in some instances when it comes to specific hard once per turn effects. I would say there's not many instances where that would come up, but it is actually relevant, so do bear that in mind. One of the biggest downsides about this card when you compare it to something like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence is the fact that Veiler and Impermanence are not hard once per turn. You can activate multiple copies in the same turn, and that's a pretty big deal, especially if you're like going second. You can just drop multiple Veilers or drop multiple Impermanence and actually be able to slow your opponent down. So drawing multiples isn't a bad thing, whereas Evening Crescent, it is a hard once per turn. And the thing is, it's not like Ash Blossom where it's going to be like a huge impactful end your turn type of effect. I guess depending on like how your opponent's hand is, it could potentially be enough, but I feel like if they drew that subpar, then it's not going to be you're probably winning that game anyway. That's kind of the point that I'm trying to drive home here. One of the interesting things about Evening Crescent is that you can use it at a very different time than you would like something like, let's say, Veiler or Impermanence, because it's not restricted like, let's say, Veiler, where you can only use it during your opponent's main phase. One of the interesting things about Evening Crescent is that you can actually use it during your own turn to kind of slow your opponent down, and that's something that is a little bit unique, especially if you're going second. So let's say you're going second and you're going up against something like Orcust, right? And your opponent at some point is going to do something like summon Dingirsu against you by banishing their symbol skeleton. Well, when they use the effect of the Dingirsu, you can go ahead and use the effect of your Evening Crescent to be able to negate that from being able to have the Dingirsu send one of your monster, so that seems pretty cool. I guess another interaction could be something like, let's say your opponent uses their IP Masquerena and tags out into something like Nightmare Unicorn. Well, since a monster was summoned, you can use the Evening Crescent in response, and then that way you can prevent Unicorn from being able to send any of your monsters back into your deck. So that again seems pretty neat. I guess you could also say, by extension, let's take a card like Artifact Scythe, right? Artifact Scythe is a card that you'll typically see in games 2 and 3 coming coming out of the side deck when you know that your opponent is going to be going first, depending on the matchup. If your opponent uses their Sanctum, summons their Scythe out of their deck, since a monster was summoned, you can use the Evening Crescent, negate the Scythe, and that seems pretty good. Being able to stop Scythe from being able to lock you down is definitely a hindrance, and it's a card that can be very annoying to deal with in some instances, and a lot of people know to play around a card like, for instance, Impermanence. So being able to use Evening Crescent, because it's not restricted by when it can be used, because Impermanence, just by contrast, you can't have any cards on the field, so they know, as soon as your opponent knows that you have a card on the field, you're not going to be hitting Impermanence anytime soon. So again, it's a very interesting and unique card in terms of when you're going to be wanting to apply it in any specific instance. Another aspect of this card I want to discuss is the burn damage, because I think a lot of people are overlooking the burn damage element to this card, and I think that's something that shouldn't be overlooked for a few reasons, because as soon as the card that's affected by Evening Crescent leaves the field, your opponent is going to take the damage for that monster's original attack. And yes, while that may not seem like a big deal, like I would say probably on average your opponent might take like anywhere from like 18 to 2,000 damage, just because of the attack power of some high level monsters that can be special summoned. On average, they're probably going to take about a quarter of their life points in terms of damage, but you have to think of how much that actually stacks up and how much that actually matters in the grand scheme of a game, because let's take a look at some decks. I mean, when you look at decks that incorporate cards like Destrudo that are going to pay half their life points just to get Destrudo onto the board, well, they're already at 4,000, and then if you use Evening Crescent on any of their cards that they're probably going to be using to combo off to end on some ridiculous turn 1 board, well, they might have to pay another 2,000 just to be able to get that card off the field, or I guess 2,000, they're going to take 2,000 as a result of linking that card off or doing something with it. So then they're going to be down to like 2,000 life points, maybe even less than that, depending on the card that you hit with it. And that could actually matter a lot, because then your new win condition doesn't necessarily have to be what your deck does, but all you have to do is just find a way to deal like 1,000 or 2,000 damage to your opponent's life points, and you just won the game like that. So the burn damage actually can matter a lot. Think about it from a comeback perspective as well. Let's say your opponent is on like maybe 1,500 life points, and they're trying to get back into the game. If you use the Evening Crescent on a monster that's going to have more attack power than life points that they currently have, if they do anything with that card, they just flat out lose the game, and Evening Crescent just won it for you. So that can just be another very powerful way that Evening Crescent could be effective. And as we all know, the end of match procedures are a thing, especially at higher tiers of tournament play, and if you're not prepared to deal with something like this, then it's going to be a card that can just win a game out of nowhere. Now, I don't think this is probably as good as something, say, like Spooky Dogwood, because I think the problem is that, especially when you're looking at it from the time perspective, your opponent can just choose to leave that card on the field, right? I mean, sure, it probably just completely stagnates any of their plays, but they don't have to take the damage. They can just stop right there, and you're still going to have an equal life total compared to your opponent. Whereas something like, say, Spooky Dogwood, by comparison, you can chain it in response, and so you're going to gain the life points regardless, and no matter what, that is going to force you to have the higher life total. So I think in terms of like a gimmicky time card, I think Spooky Dogwood's probably better if you're trying to pull that type of mechanic off, but I think overall Evening Crescent is a better card just because it actually does something. It affects the board and actually will stop your opponent from advancing their game state, because at the end of the day, Evening Crescent is an effect negator, and that's what matters most. But I think the thing I don't like the most about Evening Crescent and Autumn Shower is the fact that it doesn't hit normal summons, and that's a really big deal, because think about, in the context of some of the best decks of the format, how just crucial their normal summon is, and sometimes if that normal summon gets stopped, their turn can just flat out end. Take a look at a deck like Orcus, for instance. You know, when you have cards like Mathematician or Armageddon Knight, or any of these one-card starters, Scrap Recycler's another one, as soon as that card get hit by any sort of effect negation whatsoever, like Valor, Impermanence, Ash Blossom, if your opponent doesn't have an extender, their turn literally just stops and they just pass play over to you. And the fact that this card cannot hit normal summons is a really big deal, and I think that's probably what's going to deter people from playing this card more than anything. But I think what's interesting about it is that there's just yet another effect negator that you can opt to play. So if you're looking to like really stop your opponent from using effects altogether, you could just play everything, right? Like you could play Valor, you could play Impermanence, you could play Evening Crescent, and right there you have 9 effect negators that you can play to thwart your opponent and slow them down. But again, it's about the quality of your effect negators that matters. And yes, while Effect Veiler is relegated specifically to the main phase, there's nowhere on the text that says it can't hit monsters that were normal summoned, and I think that is probably one of the make or break moments when it comes for Evening Crescent. Another thing is the fact that you can't use multiple in a turn. I think that's a very big deal because I don't think it does enough to warrant that hard once per turn in terms of running it in any deck. Because again, when you have cards like Impermanence and Veiler, yes, they're going to be stopping stuff a lot more often, and they're going to be getting the job done much more frequently when you compare it to a card like Evening Crescent. And last but not least, it still loses to Called by the Grave. Like, this is still a hand trap, keep that in mind. And when you compare it again to a card like Infinite Impermanence cannot be hit by Called by the Grave, and that's a very big distinction. Now, I think Evening Crescent still has like a couple redeeming factors, and I still think people are going to experiment with it just because of the hybrid of being able to negate an effect plus having that burn damage component. I still think the card will see play, but when you compare it to stuff like your more traditional effect negators like your Veiler and your Impermanence, I think players are going to want to stick with them just because they're tried and true and they do the job better and they can stop that crucial normal summon. And when it gets down to it, it just does the job better than Evening Crescent can. So it's unfortunate. I don't really think it's going to see a ton of play. I think some people are going to mess around with it though, but we'll just have to wait and see. Guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Evening Crescent and Autumn Shadow. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.